Welcome, everyone, and good morning and good afternoon to our European friends. My name is Nina Sachdev. I'm the Director of Communications for Media Impact Funders. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's discussion on global journalism funding. And thanks so much to our friends at the Journalism Funders Forum for co-hosting this discussion with us. So MIF has had a long interest in understanding the global media funding landscape. Over the years, we've engaged global media funders and the journalists and media makers they support to understand the unique priorities and challenges of this ecosystem. In 2019, we published a comprehensive report with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that provided a global view of the state of media funding. And of course, so much has changed since that time. And so at the start of this year, the Gates Foundation approached us again and asked if we might do an updated analysis. We published that analysis a couple months ago, and the research for that report is partly based on a survey of global journalism funders, and another part is analysis of grants from our grants data map, which is powered by Candid. You'll hear about this research in just a moment, but basically what we set out to do was better understand how funders are examining their own journalism funding strategies. The survey component of this research gave us some insights on where funders are making grants, from which portfolios those grants are originating, and their motivations for supporting journalism. And much of what you'll be hearing in this discussion today is a focus on motivations. Specifically, our survey revealed that the safety and security of journalists ranked last in a question to funders about their reasons for supporting journalism. This finding, of course, was definitely a bit of a surprise to us, and it's fairly concerning given the current context in an era of backsliding democracies, not to mention a year in which half the world will be voting in an election. But that's just one survey, and our panelists today will provide much more context and nuance to these findings and this priority in particular. So with that, I will pass the mic to our moderator for this discussion, Liz Baker, Senior Director at Humanity United, for whom we know safety and security is a huge priority. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks for putting this together. And welcome to the folks coming in from JFF who haven't been at previous MIF events. As Nina said, I'm Liz Baker. I'm from an organization called Humanity United, and I lead their journalism funding program. But today I'm mainly here to shepherd a conversation between a few different perspectives on what's being funded in journalism today and what are some of the gaps. And I'm particularly glad to see such a broad group of funders in the room today with different approaches and different motivations for supporting journalism. So, as Nina said, we'll be taking a look at this research that MIF and Gates commissioned from Dot Connector Studio. And that'll be the first part of what we're doing today. And after that, we'll take a few questions if you have any about the research. And in the second part, we'll be discussing the findings with Ebru Ekun from Adesium and Lucy Westcott from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And there'll be another time for more Q&A at the end. So after Katie speaks, we'll have our discussion with Ebru and Lucy. So let's start off with you, Katie Donnelly, a research consultant with Dot Connector Studio, who led the work on this targeted snapshot of today's funding landscape. So I'll let Katie take it from here.
Thanks so much, Liz. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay. All right, so as was previously explained, my colleague Jenna Rines and I conducted this research. I'm the co-founder of Dot Connector Studio. We are a strategy firm based in Philadelphia. We work a lot with foundations, primarily to help them think about the future and get a little bit outside of these very reactive kind of 3 to 5 year plans and into more long-term thinking. We've also been tracking trends in media and journalism for over a decade, so we were really excited to work on this project. So about this research, it was commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's an update to the previous report from 2019. And some important caveats are that this is a snapshot. It is not meant to be a comprehensive picture. It's meant to be a discussion starter. So we're having that discussion today. Also, due to limitations in the data sets that were available to us, despite this being a focus on global journalism funding, most of the data we have access to is heavy on North American funders. So again, it's not comprehensive, it's a snapshot. We also had a limited time frame to complete this research. So, there are many other areas to dig into, and we only did this in a couple of months, so we didn't have time to dig into every nuance. Hopefully there'll be opportunities for follow-up research, and hopefully the next time this research is conducted, there will be much more comprehensive global data sets. So this research took two forms. One, we used data from the Candid Foundation Maps for Media Funding to see how 25 of the top foundations are funding journalism. So these are 25 of the top. They are not the 25 top because, again, there were limitations on what data was available to us. And then the second part was survey research through MIF's network, which was more of a pulse check. And we added some interviews with journalists and funders just to get some additional context to those survey results. I believe, I don't have the chat up, but I believe that the links to both of these will be put into the chat. So what we found when we looked into how 25 of the top journalism funders are funding journalism, first of all, we found that they gave over $1 billion in journalism funds and $5.4 billion from 2018 to 2022. So this seemed like a lot to us. We were happy to see it. This was just 25 funders, and there was over $1 billion in that time frame. So that shows us that there is money in this field, and maybe there are opportunities for more strategy around where that money is going. We saw that funding spiked in 2020, which we were not surprised about, and it still remains higher than it was at 2020. So it's kind of a upward trend, and then it seems to be maybe leveling off a little bit. And of course, given the limitations of our data set, we saw most of the funds were going to North American recipients, with 5.5 going to European recipients, 3% going to African recipients, and 0.5% to Asian recipients. Our survey research, we got 47 responses. These were anonymous. And while that may not be the largest sample set, these did represent funders of all sizes: private, community, family foundations, public charities, regranting organizations, pooled funds, individual donors. And there were respondents from the US, Liechtenstein, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the UK, plus 2 respondents who had headquarters in multiple geographic locations. So our first finding was that the majority of foundations reported an increase in journalism funding over the past 5 years. However, the foundations were mixed as to where journalism fits as a priority within their foundations. So it's kind of all over the map here. Luckily, very few said it was a very low priority, but it doesn't really tell us a clear story about how foundations are valuing journalism as a priority. When we looked into how journalism grants are distributed, we found that many of them come from a dedicated journalism grants portfolio. This is new from the last time we did this research. When journalism funds were linked to a specific portfolio, it completely ran the gamut. It could be linked to climate change or health or global development or nuclear weapons. We saw foster care. We saw all kinds of programs being linked to journalism funds. And then funders reported a variety of motivations for supporting journalism. And this is what we'll dig into more in the conversation. The top choice was to help promote civic engagement with trusted news and information. And then, of course, we saw people wanting to counteract misinformation, protect journalism as an important institution, protect democracy, support education and training, raise awareness around a specific issue, to improve journalism development in a specific geographic location. And then all the way down at the bottom, we have to protect the safety of journalists. So that was a bit of a red flag for us. When we talked to journalists, obviously, safety was a really big issue for them. We talked to journalists in Nigeria and in Ukraine, and I won't go into too much of what they said because the folks who are speaking after me will have more to say about this. But Suffice it to say, we know journalist safety is a huge issue all around the world, and we were sad to see it at the bottom of the list. Now, we also see that funders face a variety of challenges. The biggest challenge funders reported was supporting viable journalism business models in the context of instability of the larger journalism industry. So we know that business models are imploding. We know that it's very chaotic out there. And funders ranked supporting business models as the main challenge. And then if you look through this list of the challenges, you'll see again that all the way at the bottom with only 8% is increased danger for journalism grantees. Now I'll just leave you with this positive slide, which is, how do you feel about philanthropy's opportunity to make an impact in the field of journalism? So despite all of the challenges that funders named, funders remain overwhelmingly optimistic. You'll see right down here, that very pessimistic, that was only one person. The vast majority of funders who responded to this survey are overwhelmingly optimistic about philanthropy's opportunity to make an impact in the field of journalism. So with that, I'll turn it back to Liz and just leave you with a couple of main thoughts about why do we think safety is so low, and do you agree with this optimistic take? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Katie. And we can open up the chat to a few quick questions for Katie. If you're just ruminating on this and want to circle back later, we can do that as well. But if you have any burning and pressing questions right now on the data or the research, speak up. You can go on the chat, you can ping Roshni or me directly, or you could just go off mute now. Okay, moving on then. The focus for the rest of this conversation is going to be on these two kind of critical pieces that Katie referenced, which is the focus and the support for supporting mis and disinformation work versus the seeming kind of lack of prioritization for journalists' safety and security from funders. So we're going to have a conversation now with two people who are working on different parts of this work. I think the fact that there was so little focus on supporting safety and security, I found really quite surprising, given how interlinked they are. And I think especially in this kind of year of elections, we've seen how important it is to be addressing both of these critical issues. So I'm going to start this conversation with Ebru, who's the Public Interest Program Manager at Adesium Foundation. And she's also the co-chair of Journalism Funders Forum, JFF, which is hosted at Philea. So Ebru, can you just talk about why you're supporting journalism and just how this is related to combating mis and disinformation, just how you're going about that right now?
Yes, thank you for the question, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Maybe to start off with clarifying that we don't right now directly work on combating disinformation or misinformation, but I'll walk you through how indirectly it's still part of our work and how we might look into it in the future in our new strategy. But within our current strategy and for the last 10 years, Adesium's reason to fund journalism has basically been believing that it's crucial to have quality information available. And this for mainly two reasons. One is to make sure that journalism can play a good watchdog role and hold powerful people and institutions to account. And the other is to make sure that people can make informed decisions based on the quality information that we can help produce. Whenever I talk about this, it sounds like a lot, but actually we're a relatively small Dutch family foundation with not a huge budget. And I do want to clarify that we have a strict interpretation of what quality information actually is. In our context, it's cross-border collaborative investigative journalism in Europe. And that's basically those who coordinate and produce the cross-border collaborations like ICIJ's Europe Work, Lighthouse Reports, Investigate Europe. I would say that's roughly 80% of our budget. And then the remainder of our budget goes to what we call safeguarding and fostering the role of journalism. And that's basically looking into emergency mechanisms where we prioritize judicial harassment. And I promised Lucy I wouldn't go too much into the details of this because this is her topic to discuss, but maybe just to very briefly explain why it is still part of our portfolio. And that's because we see that journalists are being threatened and attacked for the very impactful stories that we want them to produce with the money that we provide. So then we also believe that it's our responsibility to make sure that when they're being threatened or attacked, that there are mechanisms that they can actually turn to. Another theme that kind of touches upon disinformation, but not directly, is another theme that is covered by another colleague of mine. It's called responsible digitalization. And there we work on regulating big tech through advocacy for Brussels-based legislation. So the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act. And that doesn't necessarily cover disinformation, doesn't only cover disinformation, but it also is supposed to regulate the space within which disinformation can or cannot be amplified. And if I would summarize how these two themes are somehow connected to combating disinformation, I would say that the journalism portfolio makes sure that there is a qualitative alternative out there to disinformation. And that our responsible digitalization theme, it focuses on regulating the space within which this information can spread so quickly. But we're in our final year of our current strategy, and we're coming to the realization that these two approaches alone are not enough. And while it's not finalized yet, from next year onwards, we're going to have our new strategy, and then we're definitely going to look more into the digital space within which quality information is being distributed. And disinformation is going to get a much, much bigger role there, most likely, because we see that it's an intentional undermining tactic that's being used very widely. And just thinking that putting a lot of money into quality information is going to suddenly land in very broad audiences is simply not a realistic approach. We need to make sure that there's a more, well, a fair, equal playing field, I would say, so that the quality information doesn't only have to compete for the attention of people, but that it also has, I'm going into a more abstract discussion here, but that it basically has a chance of reaching people on platforms where disinformation and misinformation is being pushed up much higher on the agenda versus quality information, which is being kept small. So we can put endless amount of money, which we should, into journalism, but it won't reach broad audiences if we don't also take the digital space within which it's distributed into consideration. So that's just a short abstract indication on where we're moving towards.
No, that's really interesting, Ebru, and thank you. I'm curious, given that your strategy is evolving, just how you see the landscape having evolved in recent years, and what you think are the most urgent challenges to address in the mis and disinfo as you continue to work on this.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I think disinformation in itself is not a new phenomenon, right? Like, it's always existed also before the internet. The problem is that in the last 2 decades that it's being amplified like crazy because of the business model of platforms. And what we're also noticing that it's being done with more sophistication in the last years as well, with the rise of deep fakes. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell the difference between quality information, fact-checked information, and disinformation and misinformation. And what I'm noticing more and more when I talk to journalists is that in the past, when I would ask them what are the biggest obstacles that you're experiencing, they would mention, of course, always funding, which continues to be a reality that can also not be ignored. Then the next one would be safety and security. But now I'm increasingly also hearing journalists mention that disinformation and polarization is really an obstacle to reaching broader audiences. And I think that's something that, at least at Adessium, we have always had as part of our analysis, but have not made part of our interventions on how to support journalism. So I think that's my main observation on the trends in this.
Thanks, Ebru. And I think the point you're making about just, creating that environment where there's like a lack of trust really is important. And it's really relevant to the critical issues around safety and security. And I think we've all seen that as trust in media erodes, it's journalists just can be much more targeted and harassed, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm really, really pleased that Lucy Westcott, the Emergencies Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, is joining us, who can speak really deeply to these issues. So Lucy, following what Ebru said, and given that the report noted that supporting safety and security is not a key priority for journalism funders, do you think that that accurately reflects your experiences and your conversations with funders? And can you just broadly talk about why supporting this work is so critical and how it helps the ecosystem? I know that's a lot of questions, so answer as you will, but love to hear from you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for the question, and it is great to be here with everyone today. So first of all, if we go back to that 17% figure, it is a striking one, and it is a red flag, as Katie pointed out, and it is strikingly low when we look at the other motivations. So while I think there is a general consensus among funders about the importance of funding journalist safety and security, and we at CPJ are very lucky to have a group of funders who understand this importance, I don't think across the board we're necessarily seeing that being put into action. So I think there is still a gap where journalists fit into the wider landscape of those who need safety and security assistance. And I do think that there is a disconnect between this understanding and then putting it into action. So I think it's fair to say that journalist safety and funding for journalist safety is falling through the cracks at an extremely crucial time. We know safety and security, journalist safety and security is one of the 3 key pillars of CPJ's work, alongside advocacy around and the documentation of press freedom violations around the world. And the work of my team, CPJ's emergencies team, focuses on just that, journalist safety and assistance, which is a press freedom issue. So it is very confounding, given that journalism is an increasingly dangerous job, whether it's physical safety, digital safety, mental health concerns, or increasingly legal threats, that funding for this particular topic would be so low. How bad is it? If we look at data from CPJ last year, we documented 320 journalists behind bars, which was the 3rd consecutive year of this number being above 300. And we also documented last year 78 journalists who were killed, which is the highest number since 2015. So we know it is a deeply dangerous landscape around the world. So we know as well that supporting journalist safety and security is critical for the ability for journalism to actually happen and for reporters to do their jobs. So this is reflected in CPJ's strategic plan, which is currently in its 2nd year. And the very first primary part of that plan was expanding our journalist assistance and safety work, because we recognize the needs of the journalists around the world, and again, this very difficult landscape that they are working in. And I have a key figure that reflects this increase. So when I joined CPJ in 2018, our annual assistance budget for helping journalists all over the world was $200,000. This year, that has increased to $1 million for the entire world, which we are well on track to spend this year. And then in terms of the wider ecosystem, it is important to note that journalist safety is a problem that shows up absolutely everywhere. It is not just in conflict zones or repressive environments, it is everywhere, and it has worsened. So it shows up again in these multiple overlapping ways: physical, digital, psychosocial, and increasingly legal threats. So when a journalist is attacked, it is meant to silence them and their journalism. And the safety of journalists, again, if we go back to the wider landscape, the ecosystem, it is fundamentally tied to press freedom and fundamentally tied to the very act and role of journalism in society.
Thanks, Lucy. And to your point that the risks to journalists can look really different worldwide and in different contexts, but it makes them no less pernicious. I'm curious, just this is a loaded question, but who do you think carries the weight of responsibility for journalist safety and security? Do you think funders should be carrying more of that? Do you think it's press organizations? And Ebru, please feel free to jump in as well on your take on this.
Sure. I'm happy to start. So who carries the weight, who carries the risks? Primarily it is the newsrooms and the news organizations that are employing journalists to do excellent, wonderful, critical, important journalism. And it's also important to point out that that applies to both staffers, so people who are employed by that newsroom, as well as freelance journalists who tend to not traditionally have that support system in a newsroom. Organizations like CPJ, like many of our partner organizations, we certainly bear a responsibility. CPJ puts out a lot of safety guidance on various topics, from protests to covering the environment. We have experts at CPJ who can provide direct one-on-one or larger group safety consultations. But it, to me, is the responsibility of the newsroom to make sure, and the news organization to ensure that they have steps in place to protect those who work for them. And again, to make sure that safety is built in to the very act of reporting as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that Lucy said. I do think funders, especially those who are working on journalism or on human rights or any other topic, also welcome, but especially those two have a responsibility to make sure that these newsrooms can also actually provide this kind of safety and security. And I think for that it's crucial to have core funding in order to be able to develop the necessary policies, but also when necessary to be able to very flexibly move around the money in a way to get support. And then for the press freedom organizations that do provide this kind of support to, well, be consulted when needed, but also if those newsrooms cannot afford to get specific kind of support, say, for example, in a lawsuit, that they definitely have the ability, the option to reach out to press freedom organizations. So I think, well, we all carry this responsibility.
Hear, hear. Thanks, both of you. Just moving the conversation a little bit in a different direction. I know both of you are working on tackling kind of massive issues that won't be solved in a vacuum. So as funders, I know we all talk quite often about collaboration. Ebru, I know much of your work is cross-border collaboration. I'm just curious about how you're both thinking about that in your own contexts. So Ebru, I'd love to hear just a bit more about your thoughts on cross-sectoral collaboration as well, to tackle big problems, just and even beyond mis and disinformation, just how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of collaboration. I think it shows that together the sector, but also cross-sectoral, you can achieve much more. You add different kind of perspectives, you add different kind of skills to very big problems that are trying to be tackled with relatively small amounts of money. Even though the statistics in the report were very welcome compared to the problems that we're trying to tackle is, of course, quite small. And I think if we look at the journalism side, I haven't been around for that space for that long, but if you look back for over a decade, it's been amazing to see that journalists are able to collaborate within their own markets, but also, well, their national markets, but also across borders in content and achieve real impact. And I think these are all examples, well, there are a lot of examples where you can see that in content, things are being achieved that wouldn't have been achieved without collaboration. So if we look back at the biggest first collaboration that I at least am aware of, the Panama Papers, that was groundbreaking and that provided a whole different approach to journalism and the content. And if you look more recently in the Aegean Sea region, where illegal pushbacks had been mentioned by refugee rights organizations for many years, but were just not managing to get the topic as high on the agenda, not because of their lack of ability, but I think because politicians were looking at away more. With the work of Lighthouse reports, it's been possible to really document and prove that illegal pushbacks are happening there much more than anyone was willing to admit. And now Frontex is being investigated for its involvement in that. So I think in content, collaboration is going in the right direction. You also see more and more that different kind of sectors are being involved in this as well. You see that academics are being involved. You, to a certain extent, without affecting the editorial integrity of journalists, see some collaboration on with civil society organizations. So I think when it comes to the content part, that we've made a lot of progress and are going in the right direction. I think where I would like to see more collaboration, and if there's anyone in this virtual room that can provide more examples on this, then I'd also be happy to continue that conversation later, is collaboration on the non-content part as well. So when we look at these cross-border collaborations, I think there needs to be more collaboration on seeing how this model can be developed in a way that's going to be more financially sustainable and more equitable. How do we make sure that these entities that coordinate the cross-border stories also make sure that those who are part of the stories receive funding for this as well? And this is a question for funders to answer as well. This is not just for the not-for-profits to figure out on their own. We also need to play a bigger responsibility in this as funders. And another positive example that I've seen on the collaboration side that I'm excited about is, I'm not sure by which name they go now, but the Tech Alliance or the Journalism Cloud Alliance, which is basically looking into possibilities of making data storage and processing capacity more accessible and affordable for investigative journalists and data newsrooms. I think the fact that they're collaborating now more with academics and with philanthropy in order to see how they can have a better and stronger negotiating power with big tech in this kind of issue, I think those are the kind of examples that I would like to see more. So the content part, that's going great, but how do we see the sector collaborating more together in tackling problems that are affecting all of them?
That's great. And I'm just flagging to the MIF folks, I think this is a whole separate meeting that it would be great to have at some point too, about the beyond the content infrastructure. But thank you for that. That's fascinating. Lucy, I think like Ebru, you work in a lot of coalitions and collaborations, and I know they're really essential for protecting and supporting journalism orgs. So can you talk to us a bit about what those are, but also where you think there might be gaps as well that need more support, need more organization?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Liz. So yes, collaboration is absolutely essential to the work of journalist safety and assistance, whether that is financial support, so the providing of grants to journalists and to groups of journalists, as well as that non-financial support, meaning the actual providing of safety advice or guidance to journalists. So if we look at the top countries where CPJ gave assistance to journalists in 2023, these countries won't be surprising, but I will bring them up for a reason. Russia, Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, and Ukraine. So journalists from those countries made up the bulk of our assistance work. These are all countries that have, they're all, first of all, dangerous places for journalists, but they have existing and importantly, entrenched crises involving the press. So many of these are now long-term crises, more than a year, and new emergencies crop up months or years into the conflicts or the situation. So we continue to help and step in, but we need the help of our fantastic partner organizations to do that as well. We all have different mandates. If we cannot help someone, we will often refer a journalist to an organization who can. So the collaboration piece is extremely important. What this allows us to do as well is to think and be very creative in our approach to helping journalists and providing assistance, and to figure out how we can be impactful and effective beyond just the individual grant, which of course is a cornerstone of our work. But those countries I mentioned, those crises, they are still going on, and we need to continue to figure out ways to help the journalists who are reporting through them. We are part of a number of really effective journalist safety coalitions, including the Coalition Against Online Violence, the Journalists in Distress Network, or the JID network, as well as the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk, or the LINJAR. All of these collaborations and these coalitions are trying to solve huge issues that are pretty consistent within the journalist safety and assistance space. A really great recent and ongoing collaborative effort to highlight here is actually our ongoing US election safety workshops that we have been running with the IWMF and PEN America. For something like this, where we are, again, delivering safety guidance and training to journalists, it's critical that we work with trusted partners to make sure we have the broadest audience possible, again, with that particular attention paid to local and freelance journalists, but also so we can take advantage of all the different types of expertise that we have across those organizations. And since June, together we have trained more than 250 journalists in the US on their physical, digital, legal, and psychosocial safety ahead of the election. Here, in terms of gaps, I think there is probably a gap in preventative rather than reactive funding, first of all. So we always want to be planning for the inevitable crisis that happens. We always say there's at least one emergency that happens every single year that is new, in addition to those safety emergencies that are already ongoing. So we want to be able to best prepare for the inevitable crisis. And then tied into this, I think more collaboration is needed around those rapid response mechanisms and programs. We, as the emergencies team at CPJ, can step in very, very quickly to help. It would be fantastic if we could have a lot more collaboration around that. And then there's a gap as well, I think, in what we would call the medium-term support space. So we can help in an acute emergency. Many of our partner organizations can help months or years down the road, but it's that middle piece that I think we're still missing. There's also a gap, I think, in collaborating with organizations that are outside of the traditional press freedom space. So a really good example there is journalists in exile, and exile is a massive topic for many organizations, ourselves included, and having better relationships with refugee resettlement organizations, humanitarian organizations that again exist outside of that journalism space, I think could really help to strengthen our work there too. And I will say related lawyers or legal support specifically for journalists in exile is a massive gap.
Right, thank you for that. You could see us all nodding our heads. I think both of you have given us a lot to think about. We do already have questions coming in, so I think let's shift to the Q&A section. Please use the chat or raise your hand or however to ask questions for Lucy and Ebru, and Katie, if any have come to mind. Ebru, to start, we have a question about why did the ADESIUM Board of Directors or leadership focus on quality of information, and just how long-standing or new is that program? So if you want to dig into that, that would be terrific.
Sorry, we've been doing Zoom for a long time, but this whole mute thing still goes wrong sometimes. It's been over a decade that ADESIUM has been funding journalism, and it's been in the capacity of quality information since then as well. It all started with discovering the predecessors of ICIJ and being inspired by the work that they do and supporting that. I think as a foundation, we've gone back and forth between the terms quality information and public interest journalism, and that's been in times of the program widening and including some non-journalism entities that also produce quality information, and then narrowing down, and that usually goes also with budgetary changes as well. So when you narrow down, you narrow down the focus of who the producer of that content is. And if you have more space, then you have the ability to look at other kind of content producers as well.
Great. Flagging that Vince has put in some links in the chat on the safety of journalists among funders, raising that beyond funders and other elites. Thank you for that. Another question is on how to work with local journalists who have fewer resources. So what strategies do you think as funders we can employ to support local journalists at the forefront of both combating misinformation, but also taking on an outsized risk in their environment? And, you know, let's please look at local in various contexts, not only domestically, but in various other places as well. And I think either or both of you, I would love to hear your answers on it.
I'm happy to start, and thank you for that question. I think the first thing is to just listen, listen to the journalist and listen to what their needs, their concerns are. It could be very, very complicated. It could be, depending on the context as well, it could be very different. But I think, first of all, understanding what their needs are, and then connecting them to either local organizations in their country, I think, are always the best way to start. And then we are here always as backup, as support, for providing resources to journalists, and again, to speaking directly with journalists about their safety needs, digital, physical, and how they can mitigate those risks as well. I would always go back to that preventative piece. At CPJ, we are very much into planning and preparing, and really taking the steps to lessen the likelihood that something will happen. It's inevitable that something might, but making sure journalists are equipped and empowered to do their jobs, particularly local journalists, is super important.
Great. I think that is terrific. And moving on to data questions, we have 2 data questions. One from Erica on do we know from the report or the data itself what percentage of the overall funding for journalism goes directly to newsrooms or journalists? Katie, this is for you. And we also have another question from Jonathan. If you want to say it aloud, feel free. If not, I can read it from the chat.
I can speak if you'd like, Liz. Shall I speak? Thank you. I won't add a lot to what I said in the chat, but I mean, just basically, Katie, I thought it was really interesting that you identified that enormous challenge that funders say they face around supporting business models. But I just wanted to sort of drill down a little bit. Are they saying that they just don't know what is a good business model? Because that's one question, but there are answers to that question. Or are they saying they don't know exactly how to provide the right kind of support to help news organizations develop business models?
Okay, great question. I'm going to answer Erica's question first because it's a quicker answer. So we don't know that. That would require another level of drilling down that we just didn't have time to do. And because we don't know that, like, another important thing I forgot to mention is that we don't know how much of the funding, the international funding, is going through intermediary organizations and then going to newsrooms. So this would all be something that, would have to happen in another round of research. So yes, Erica, the answer is we don't have that. Jonathan, that is a super interesting question. And I think it's part of a much larger discussion. I think because the overarching journalism business models in the for-profit journalism space are all over the place. Social media caused a huge disruption. AI is causing a huge disruption. I think there are debates that maybe Vince or someone from MIF could speak to a little bit more, but I think there are debates around how funders are operating given this larger context of uncertainty, and whether funders need to be helping news organizations set up sustainable business models, or if funders are just putting a stake in the ground and saying, there is a role for philanthropic support of news. We don't expect you to be sustainable. We're going to just keep supporting you, and like, don't worry about making money. And then there are all these debates about whether funders should be supporting for-profit organizations or a combination of nonprofit and for-profit. So I think that is really more of what we're getting at. Vince, since I did call you out, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, well, I would just say, and maybe I'll draw on what I've heard from Carol Bogart in particular at the Marshall Project. But I think she's not the only person who's framed this. We often think about philanthropy as one model and business sustainability as another model. But there's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking of philanthropy as a portion of what makes an organization sustainable. That there are recurring business revenues of all types, and maybe there are individual donations, but that a portion of foundation philanthropy or organized philanthropy is just one piece of sustainability and not a different path. For sure, hospitals, universities, symphonies have always had a continuing role of philanthropy to make an organization sustainable. But of course, the recurring revenue is a fundamental part of all of those institutions. So I would just add that nuance to the dichotomy that doesn't need to always be the way to think about it.
Thanks, Vince, and appreciate that. Katie, did you have anything you wanted to continue to touch on that?
Jonathan, was that helpful? Oh, okay, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
I keep putting you on the spot, Jonathan. Sorry.
Thank you both. Yeah, really helpful.
We did have some really interesting pieces in the chat just from Marcia and Natalie. So given that we have this space, I would invite you both to quickly just share with us some of the things that you just put on there that I think are relevant to the conversation we've been having, rather than just leave it on the chat. Marcia, do you want to jump on for a sec?
Thank you, Liz. This has been so great, you guys, and thank you for just all the work you're doing in this space. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure people knew that, I mean, it's pretty new, it's about a year old, but we did set up an independent foundation. It's not the Times, just was a group of people, including me, who were been engaged at the Times, but they are supporting the fund itself. And it is open to exile journalists who have come to the US to resettle, and it's specifically to help them with education for them and their families, because you guys all know what happens with exile journalists when they come to the States. Their families have to start over, they and their families, and education is a huge need. So, I mean, we are raising money, but we've got money now, and we're actively working with exile journalists from wherever who have come to who are here now in the United States.
Great, thanks, Marcia. And Natalie, you have you were flagging freelancers. I know Lucy was talking about ACOS earlier, and you flagged that, but is there anything you wanted to kind of share or add about some of the safety and security
Yeah, I
that
mean,
you
I put
began
the
to
link.
experience?
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Marcia, for what you all are doing over at the Times. I think that's amazing. What a great initiative. And this is a fascinating conversation. I just wanted to say, you know, for us at the Pulitzer Center, this has been an ongoing issue because we do support so many projects in conflict zones and increasingly with environmental activists. And so these are considerations for us on an ongoing basis. And thankfully, we haven't had too many issues, but we certainly have had journalists at risk, including very recently. And so as part of our requirements before we fund a project, we have to have a guarantee that the outlets will have the journalists back so that we avoid these freelancers, 20-year-olds going into Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, and outlets paying money for the stories, but not ensuring their safety. So I think that's a tough, it's actually been very complex, and we've had journalists be very upset with us because they're like, well, if you don't give me money, then I can't do the reporting, and then I can't get a career. And putting that onus on the outlets, though, I mean, I'm just very pleased to hear that you all are also, you know, reinforcing that message that ACOS has been so strong about advancing. And I hope as funders, you know, we all keep that in mind, because ultimately it is the outlets that benefit the most from the reporting that these journalists do.
Mm-hmm.
Natalie and Alex, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I think one of the things that you raised specifically was around donor collaboration, which is, you know, obviously a big thing in the US, but also more broadly. And it's also something we were touching on earlier. Would you mind talking a little bit about funding reaching newsrooms and donor collaboration?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is going to sound like, I'm going to sound like a broken record, because we say this and discuss this in every single donor collaboration conversation. But yes, I think the money that reaches newsroom is definitely smaller than the money that there is. And it's something to do with the way, you know, the overall system globally works. And I think it's particularly unequitable when it comes to the global South, for example. I think the data we have is skewed towards the US, but also realistically, the money comes out of the US and stays in the US. So there's a serious need here to look at how we can have more data on the one hand, but also how we can look at data beyond philanthropy, right? And I come from the media development world, and unfortunately, there are, a lot of reports being done about bilateral funders and ODA, and there are reports being done about philanthropic funding. But I think there's a need for, the sectors to talk to each other. And I think there's a lot of learning that bilaterals can take from, for example, the way philanthropic funding works. I'm thinking especially of unrestricted funding to organizations. But there's also a lot that we can collaborate on, because a lot of times these bilateral funders have deeper pockets and can be aligned, and can have understanding of the media space. Just to say that I've put in a new report that was done with ODA data that was commissioned by the International Fund for Public Interest Media. No surprises here. There's not enough money for media. So there's something here to think about. And I'm really grateful that we have the space also to discuss the infrastructure piece and the sort of underlying ecosystem issues at stake here. And we didn't get into AI, which is quite refreshing, because every single conversation seems to be about AI. But I do feel, we're at a moment of disruption, and there are new players coming in, and a lot of these tech sort of companies are putting money into the media space, and that we've seen them do that with social media. And I think a question for us is, how do we avoid the same mistakes, right? Because in a sense, it is the platforms that have disrupted the business model of media, and it is the platforms that are now striking deals, to feed their LLMs. And at the moment, it's the big media organizations that are able to take part in these negotiations. But I think we're at a point where we're also, as funders, funding some media outlets who will take money from these tech platforms and sort of contribute to the way AI will be overhyped, right? So I think the point Ebru was making about the ecosystem and about looking at the quality of information and sort of what can we do that is, the infrastructure, the base for the whole ecosystem to survive. I do believe safety is, really at the forefront of that. Sometimes it's not glamorous, it's not AI, but there is, real innovation that needs to happen in the safety space that is being moved. But there's also some things that are just, need to happen for people to continue to survive and for information to continue to survive. And I think, Lucy, you've made that point very clearly. So yeah, I think there's always this, we're all guilty of sometimes the hype of the moment. I think disinfo had its moments. But I think we're increasingly, seeing, more thinking on what can be done for the ecosystem. So it's great to be able to discuss this, with each other, but also beyond our usual geographies and priorities as funders, right? So thanks for convening this.
Mm-hmm.
Here. And I remember when I was looking at this information, I was wondering something very similar, which was like, I appreciated the way it was framed as this is a snapshot of this moment in the media funding. And I'm so curious on what it would look like in, say, 2 years as well. But, I think I'm going to walk away from this conversation very much thinking about infrastructure and ecosystem. I like infrastructure, that's a great word, for these kind of larger issues that I think both Ebru and Lucy brought up very early on, as these are things that as funders, we can look beyond the content. We can see where can we collaborate and fix as donors, as intermediaries, as others to figure this out. We are running low on time. So given that, I'm going to cede the floor to Ebru and Lucy for one last question, which is that you have this room full of funders or people who are deeply invested in these issues. So what is the last thing you would like to leave us with today? Both of you answer one at a time.
Okay, thanks, Liz. And again, thank you for being here today, everyone, and for a very engaging conversation, for all your questions, what you popped in the chat. Thank you. So I would love to leave you all today with the idea that the safety of journalists is fundamental to the act and art of journalism. That these two things don't need to be separated. They are very much entwined, and as essential to reporting as well-honed journalistic skills. And this essential work also costs money. This has been touched on already, but things like the things that are fundamental to journalist safety, such as personal protective equipment, extra and separate work devices for journalists, tech and safety specialists, these are all crucial to journalism actually happening safely. And without journalist safety and protection, journalism as we know it would not be possible. So it is fantastic that funders in the report want to help promote civic engagement, to protect journalism as an important institution, to protect democracy. But it means little if the journalists are actually unable to do their jobs safely. So investing in journalism safety and security is in itself investing in good journalism.
I think my summary is going to be a little bit easier, because basically what Lucy said and Alex said before that is, well, those are the things I wanted to summarize. And I think when it comes to collaborating and coordinating among funders at grantee level, that we're doing a pretty good job on a one-on-one basis, but we really need to find a better way of coordinating on a strategic level as well. I don't think that every single funder can focus on safety, security, infrastructure, or a digital ecosystem, whatever we call it, and the content production of all kind of public interest journalism, because I talked about cross-border investigative journalism, but public interest journalism is a much broader term than that. So I don't think all of us can do all of it, but we need to find a better way of coordinating it, like Alex said, on a geographic level, on a local versus national versus international level, but also on what part of content production is being tackled. I think we need to do a much better job. And I think Journalism Funders Forum and Media Impact Funders are great places to have these conversations, both digitally and in person. So yes, Alex, we were mentioning this in multiple settings, but let's hope that moving away from here that we can find a couple of not necessarily like-minded, but yeah, funders with similar ambitions in this regard.
Thank you both. And thank you, MIF and JFF, for being here. And I'll pass it off to Nina to close us out.
Thanks, Liz. So to that end, talking about spending more time with one another, I wanted to plug that our next big gathering of journalism funders is happening October 23rd and 24th at KQED headquarters in San Francisco. It's a very important gathering for connecting journalism funders. And so I highly recommend if you all can make it out there. It's not just about experiencing new content, but the networking has proved really important, and a lot of funder collaborations have stemmed from our facilitation efforts. So we hope to see you there. And don't know if Roshni put in a link to, thank you, Shannon, for putting a link in there. You can use that to learn more about what we're up to and register. And thank you all for joining us today.
This was great.
See you next time.
Thank you.